bu yüzyıldaki çözülmeyen birkaç tane sorundan bir tanesi, en önemli sorunlardan bir tanesi. Sadece Orta Doğu'yu değil, bu açıdan bütün dünya siyasetini ilgilendiren bir konu. Bundan dolayı sadece günümüzde değil, geçmişte de ve ileriki yıllarda da önemini koruyan bir sorun olarak, bir soru olarak, bir konu olarak önümüzde duruyor. Şimdi burada 4 tane panelist arkadaşımız var, profesör var. Bunlar konunun, sorunun farklı yönlerini tartışacaklar. Profesör Finkelstein en son konuşacak. İlk konuşmayı Fatih Üniversitesi'nden Phillip Amour yapacak. Bize konuya genel bir giriş yapacak. Daha sonra Hamas'ı, özelde Hamas ve barışın önündeki engellerin işleneceği 2 tane sunum var. Jenny ve Benedikt bu konuları işleyecekler. Finkelstein'da son değerlendirmeyi yaparak panelimizi tamamlayacağız. Panel sonunda soru-cevap bölümleri olacak. So welcome you all here. So we have 4 panelists speaking on Arab-Israeli and more specifically Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They will talk about different aspects of the conflict, and Phillip Amour will be the first one to go and make a presentation. At the end of the panel, we will have your questions. If we have time, I think our panelists will be more than happy to answer your questions as well. So first, Phillip Amour.
So hello everybody, it's my great pleasure to be here. As you have seen, the topic of my paper is actually the Palestine-Israeli conflict in the context of the Arab Spring. If we look at the history and politics of the Middle East in the last decades, it becomes obvious that this history and politics, it correlates with the Arab-Israeli conflict and with one of its core elements, the Palestine-Israeli conflict. And indeed, Palestine as an issue has been a core element in inter-Arab politics since the foundation of the Arab League in 1945. If we look at the Arab Spring, we even find parallels between the struggles of Arab nations against oppression, against tyranny on the one hand, and we find, as I said, parallels on the other hand between the struggle of the Palestinians against the Israeli occupation. In both, the central issues are actually self-determination, equality, and national security. So if we recognize the moralistic value of the Palestinian cause and the identity of Arabs in regard to the Palestinians, a couple of questions emerge in the context of the Arab Spring. Question number 1 is that, will the Arab Spring impose changes to the rights and living conditions of the Palestinians? My answer is yes. I believe that the Arab Springs gave, again, the Palestinian rights of self-determination, credibility, and above all, strength. And I think that the front states are not anymore willing to play the game with Israel, to function as the jailers of Israel once the siege of Gaza is concerned, for instance. My second question is actually more important, and the second question would be, is there going to be any impact of the Arab Spring in putting an end to the Palestine-Israel conflict? Would be an impact in supporting the two-state institutions, in fostering peace with Israel? My answer is No. I don't believe that in the foreseen term, the Arab Spring would have a positive impact to solve the Israel-Palestine conflict, to put an end to the Israeli occupation, or even to create a Palestinian state. And I believe this because a fundamental change in the Palestine-Israel conflict depends on the ability of the new democratic regimes in the region to foster peace with Israel, to put an end to the occupation. So the question would be how far these democracies would go in putting pressure on Israel. At the moment, in the midterm, in the long term, not much. And putting an end to the Israeli occupation is, or creating a Palestinian state is connected as well to the will of the Israeli government to accept a deal with the Palestinians. And the Israeli government is not willing now, in the context of the Arab Spring, to show a slight weakness and to compromise with the new democracies or with the Palestinians. So I won't be too optimist once it come up to the Israel-Palestine conflict. If we want to dig deeper into this second question, we can acknowledge on the first, we can acknowledge that indeed there are new regimes, there are new democracies, and these democracies are taking positions that are in coherence with their national agendas, with agendas correlated to pan-Arab issues or pan-Arab issues. But saying this, we should keep in mind that the Arab uprisings are not primarily about the Palestine-Israeli issues. They are about domestic, about local, about national issues related to jobs, related to political rights. And the Palestine cause is a minor sub-issue. We have seen it in terms of the Egyptian uprising, Egyptian revolution. It was less seen in the Tunisian case and in the Libyan case. So again, I don't see that one of the goals, one of the direct goals of the new regimes is to put an end to the Israel-Palestine conflict. This is not an objective that we will witness within the couple years or within this decade. And apart from this, as I mentioned, that a resolution of the Palestine-Israel conflict is connected to Israel. And actually, the Arab Spring created a window of opportunity for Israel to seriously review and consider its policy in the Middle East, its conflict with Arab countries. And Israel has been always claiming that it is the only democracy in the Middle East, and that peace needs a shift in the Middle East, a shift to democracy. And now you would mean that actually it is the chance to grasp this historical chance of these democracies and to make peace with the Palestinians, with the Arabs, because Israel is not anymore the only democracy. And democracies usually they negotiate among each other and foster peace. But unfortunately, once it comes to the real politics, this is not the case. We have seen that since the Arab Spring, Israel has hardened its attitudes towards the Palestinians. in particular and towards the Arab in generally. And this is due to two reasons. The reason number one is the quo status. Israel is rather interested in the quo status in the way it is now, or it used to be pre-December 2010. The Israeli leadership is interested in enemies they know, enemies they predict, enemies they can calculate, enemies they are keen on, rather than enemies they don't know, they have to study, and they are not calculated. So stability is the goal and not democracy. And supporting the status quo, supporting Assad, supporting all other regimes are actually the case. Am I running out of time? Or? So this is what might be for the Western countries or for Turkey the spring of '89 or promising to foster peace is actually frightening for Israel. Israel is afraid of the new democracies because they are not predictable for them. And number two, and this is as well important, there is a distrust and a disrespect, historically rooted distrust and disrespect of the Israeli right wing towards Muslims and towards Arabs. And the right wing has always thought that Arabs are not, they can't change themselves. And whatever they make for changes, they might say things in public, but what they think is they would never accept a Jewish state in the region. They would never, Muslims and Arabs, they would never accept a Jewish state in the Middle East, in the middle of the Arab world, Islamic world. So this is why this has been the position of Netanyahu, this has been the position of David Ben-Gurion, this has been the position of Sharon, and this has been actually the position of Shamir with slight differences, but Arabs, Muslims, new democracies, the Muslim Brotherhood are being distrusted for what they are and disrespected for being actually medieval, for being Arabs, not capable of making changes. We can add a third point to this, which is in relation to Israel identity problem. Let's have the hope that democracies in the Middle East would develop and create a real democracies a la Western democracies. Israel would face an identity problem because Israel has been always being able to differentiate itself from its neighbors by saying we are a democracy, we are Western, and the others are medieval, are conventional, traditional. So the Israeli society have been always seeing it as Western. And if Arabs, Muslims, if the neighborhood would be able to come along this path of modernization, Israel would have sort of an identity problem. And the Israeli leadership is not willing as well, is not accepting this. It's not, for them, it's sort of an utopia. So I think on the Israeli side, it's the Arab Spring has not been perceived as optimistically. Rather, it's a problem for the Israeli leadership. How is it on the Palestinian side? On the Palestinian side, we are having the problem of the fact that the Palestinians are heterogeneous. We are having the exile Palestinians with left wing and link wing and religious and secular, all of these streams, and all of this apply to the inland Palestinians. So an approach how to react to the Arab Spring should have a consensus among all of these streams, inland and exile Palestinians. And we have seen that the Arab Spring affected the Palestinian territories. People went actually on the street in Gaza, on the West Bank, and they asked their both governments, the Fatah government on the West Bank, the Hamas government on the in Gaza, to come together and to have an agreement to stop this division, which was the case. And both came and made on paper this argument. But unfortunately, because Hamas is not unified in its approach, how to deal with the Arab Spring and how to deal with the Palestinian division, and the same applies to Fatah. The Palestinian politics are stuck, and it's not helpful for the Palestinian politics as well that Israel and the USA are opposing a Palestinian state and opposing a reconciliation between Hamas and Fatah, because Israel is against any sort of unity between both parties. So I see, maybe to sum up, I see an improvement in the living conditions of the Palestinians. I see that the Palestinian cause became credibility and strength. And I think that sooner or later, the new elite in the Arab world would put an end to the Palestine-Israeli conflict. But this is not in a foreseen time. And this presupposes the success of the democracies. And this usually takes 3 decades. So I'm not that optimistic once it comes to the Middle East in terms of the Arab Spring. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Amour. And Professor Amour is unfortunately not so optimistic about the resolution of Arab-Israeli conflict in the coming days, at least in the short term. But he, I think, emphasized an important point between the relationship between democracy and peace in the region. And maybe it is time to reflect upon the idea of democratic peace, whether democracies will not fight wars among themselves. If Arab Spring, turns some Arab countries into democracies, maybe we will have more of a peace in the region. So as the democratic peace idea says, but there is also another case to be made. Democratization is a process. As a process itself is bringing out new conflicts rather than peace. So democratization is a very conflictual process. So I think if the Arab Spring has just started a lengthy process of democratization in the region, maybe we will see more of a conflict rather than a resolution of conflicts, So we have 2 ways to go at least, from different angles. But Professor Amour also mentioned about Israel's policy in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. So, and for the resolution of the Palestinian conflict, he argued that Israeli policy is the key to understanding how well the window of opportunity created by the Arab Spring will be made use of. So now it's time to move on. Ms. Jenny will talk about the obstacles, in front of the peace in the region, and so the floor is yours.
First of all, I'd like to say thank you that I have the opportunity to be here and to introduce you to my topic. It's called Obstacles to Peace. And I provided a small PowerPoint presentation for you to follow my presentation. Let us go back to the year 1948. It is the date of birth of the State of Israel. It also constitutes the year of a still ongoing conflict between the Israelis and the Palestinian people, and most of the Arab world in general. After Israel's successful war of independence, which is called a Nakba by the Arab world, the Jewish people got the so-called Promised Land. While in contrast, the Palestinians did not manage to create an own state for several reasons. Okay. Both parties of this conflict argue that they want peace and resolve the conflict converted into a mutual agreement, made by themselves and not by external actors. But if we look at their weak attempts and their heavy difficulties only to go to the negotiation table, we have to seriously ask if the mostly mentioned main elements of the conflict, so at the status of Jerusalem, is it okay with that? Okay. So the main elements of the mostly mentioned main elements of the conflict, so as a status of Jerusalem or the questions of land in general, which contains the Jewish settlements inside the annexed Palestinian territories, and the connected topic of the refugee question. Never mind if we are talking about the Palestinian refugees who live outside the country, or the so-called present absentees, or the law of return for the Jews, which made Aliyat legal and even desirable from the Israeli point of view, are really the main key factors for the overwhelming fear of the Israeli state, and that obstacles to start a peace process. Because all these questions could be negotiated in peace talks, it is wondering why already the step to start this process seems so hard. Therefore, the question rises, what is the main obstacle in the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement from an Israeli point of view? If there is really an honest and not an assumed interest in a peace agreement existing. So I argue that Israel does not have a major interest to resolve the Palestinian problem. I will leave aside the lacking interest in a peace treaty from the side of the Palestinian Authority, the Arab states, and the international community. But I will rather focus on Israel in my presentation. I claim that Israel has a need to have an enemy. But why? Israel as a state of immigrants was born out of the Zionist idea of a Jewish nation, which has its ideological root in the time of the rising of different nationalism, and uses the Jewish faith as a common ground, and therefore it worked as a constituting element of their national idea. One component of this construction is the idea of the persecuted people, who lived and still lives in fear. This fear, which was physically totally present to the Jewish people during the time of the Second World War, was without comparison and absolute real. Since Benedikt Anderson, we know about the concept of the imagined communities, who mostly started to build states due to their constructed nation. In the Israeli case, the imagined community was made and reproduced mainly by the Zionists. Regarding to Bernhard Gießen, every collective identity has a code. Code in this context means a certain piece which helps to construct this certain group. And even more important, to build the borders to define the members and the non-members of the group. The code to mark off from the outsiders of the Zionist group was and still is their Jewishness. In our present times, the Israelis, the nowadays descendants of the former Zionists, who made the immigration in that days to Palestine, and so actually immigrated to their proclaimed land of the fathers, lacked to use this code in an appropriate way. But why? It is quite hard to use Jewish elements which have a religious root to define a nation in a secular state, especially when you put in mind that the Chalutzim, the pioneers, the group of Jewish Zionists who immigrated to Palestine during the British Mandate, described themselves as secular and even rejected religion at all. This phenomenon is still present in these days. According to a survey of the Central Bureau of Statistics from 2010, which was published in an article by the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, less than half of the Israeli Jewish population call themselves secular, and so far made up the biggest group. Next to this, the Israeli society can be divided into different levels of religiousness. For example, the traditional, the Orthodox, and the ultra-Orthodox Jews next to the Arabs. To sum up in short, if the biggest group of a society made up less than half of the population, it is a heterogeneous society, which is highly visible also due to Israel's political constellation, of course. We are talking about a tremendously cleaved society in Israel. To highlight this fact, the Arab Israelis or Palestinian-Israelis, however you like, which made up 1/5 of the population, do not fit in the concept of a Jewish democratic state from the mainstream perspective of the Israeli politicians, because they are non-Jewish in religion and in ethnicity. A second notion, which is more on focus in our contemplation, is that Israel's divided society misses to define a national code, which includes all of the Jewish people, except of the fact that they are called Jews by the others. Because, as I mentioned already, a collective identity needs to have an inner code as well, in order that members of this group identify themselves as part of it. But the Jewishness misses that necessity because 42% of the Jewish Israeli people define themselves as secular and not predominantly Jews, but call themselves in opposite, or not really in opposite, but in contrast, Israelis. So I recommend to ask which common marker is shared by all Israelis. I think that the fear for the others and the extern-made definition to be a Jew is still alive, also for secular Israelis. So I maintain that the clue which keeps the Israeli society as a collective is the fear from outside. There is a need to stay a stable society to defend itself from the enemies from which Israel is surrounded, and which is definitely a real and reasonable case. If we like to mention Syria or Lebanon, which are the direct, or one of the direct neighbors to Israel. But Israel's favorite enemy are the Palestinians. The fear of them secures the huge amount of budget which is spent on the Israeli defense forces. Due to the fact that every Jewish Israeli has to join the army, it became not even a socializing institution, but even more also an identity-constructing institution. Because only every former member of the army is part of the Jewish Israeli society, and so far knows about the big security gap, which is repeated to the soldiers again and again. So in result, the Jewish Israelis are totally convinced of the permanent fear to them, their family, and their country in general. But without a Palestinian question, the need for an Israeli army will be on a totally different level, and with the acceptance of the Palestinians as a nation. The birth of their own nation, the Jewish Israeli nation, or let's say the Jewish nation who became the Israeli nation, would be in a different light. To sum up what this idea would mean to the Israelis, first, if the Jewish people are not any longer persecuted because they are Jewish, the justification of the law of return seems less acceptable because it's not any longer necessary. And to continue also, the moment of the birth of Israel would have been seen then in a different context, which would mean its narrative to have the right of a national homestead have to be re-asked. And yes, this represents an even higher fear to the Israelis, if their founding myth might be a lie. Shlomo Sand expressed already his idea that the concept of Jewish people is an invention. Never mind if it is or not, the idea of how the Jewish people should be defined varies so much that the only point of connection right now seems in the idea of security reasons. And that's the only reason why the Israeli society stick together. And therefore the best instrument are the Palestinians as a permanent danger who need to be controlled. And even from inside, the Palestinian Israelis are kept discriminated. This is made obviously best in not including them in the Israeli national Jewish concept, and makes it the main obstacle to peace from my point of view. So my conclusion is that Israel has no interest to make peace with the Palestinians. First, because they are an essential element to them to define themselves as a collective, so as a collective group. And second, they would have to rethink their national concept if the Palestinians are not any longer their enemies, and the need to include the Palestinian Israelis into the Israeli society would even be more necessary, which would bring next to all the former mentioned external factors like the settlement or Jerusalem question, also an inner discourse to the Israeli society which could have the potential to make them even collapse, and could result also in the worst case in a destruction of the state itself. So the more secure way is to prefer a status of non-peace instead of a status of non-state. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny, for your timely presentation. And Jenny identified some key obstacles, in front of the peace, and she identified the lack of determination on the part of Israeli governors, to solve the Arab-Israeli and Palestinian conflict, once and for all. And perhaps secondly, she identified, just like Professor Amour did, the heterogeneity or the divisive nature of Israeli society, and it is continuing heated identity debates within itself. And lastly, I think, as far as I see important, the Israelis' perception of the Arabs and Palestinians. These three elements, I think, still are very alive obstacles, important obstacles to peace. Now it's time to turn to Benedikt Grossmann, Mr. Benedikt, and
yeah, thank you very much. I also want to thank the University of Sakarya for the invitation. I made a handout. Actually, I copied 30 pieces, but I think it's not enough, and it's in English. I'm sorry about that. My title is The Palestinian and Hamas in Gaza Towards a Normal Political Party. Before the times of the Arab awakening, the culminating point of the integration of Islamist actors into an existing political system was the victory of Hamas in the Palestinian parliamentary elections in 2006. The legal election victory of Hamas moves an old debate, again, in the focus of scientific interest. Does the political participation of radical actors lead to their moderation? I tried to answer this question on the basis of the so-called moderation theory, or more exactly specified as the inclusion-moderation hypothesis, which basically traces the behavior of Islamist actors back to the incentives of political survival by eligibility. slow down. Okay, sorry. Okay. Sorry. This theory was originally applied to parties of socialist and Christian provenience of Europe before a remake of the theory with the focus on Islamic parties was recently drawn by Güneş Murat and Gillian Schwedler. Now I come to the theory. With the conversion of radical movements into political actors and their integration into an existing political system, they abandon their original radical ideology in order to maximize the electorate on the short term. On the long term objective is the political survival by keeping electable forever. So inevitably, radicals are being moderated by the attempt to achieve their own strategic interests. Three bottom assumptions form the political behavior of a radical party. Firstly, in order to be electable for a broader electorate, the decision makers of the radical party are confronted with a dilemma. They have to change political positions on certain issues and develop political programs which at least tend verbally to the middle stream of the electorate. Otherwise, they would not be electable for the mass of the people, and therefore have no chance in winning an election. For the second assumption, it has to be remembered that the dangers of repression by security forces of authoritarian regimes moderate radical parties. The anxiety of state repression makes radicals more moderate. The visibility in public, for example by events, meetings, and media presence at the expense of clandestine networks, increases the possibility of permanent state repression, for example in forms of imprisonment. Once Islamists are organized as electoral parties seeking mass support, they expose themselves to constant state surveillance and to outside influences that dilute their ideological cohesion. Thirdly, the political representation affects the programmatic concerning the newly acquired electorate, which is to be held or even increased within forthcoming elections. The priority of the electoral success prevails over the primarily revolutionary goals. And these new political goals require organizational resources. For example, professionalism, expertise, and competence for shaping party-like functions. The build-up of a party demands the development of a specialized and skilled cadre. The two mechanisms the two mechanisms, maximizing votes and organizational survival, transform the revolutionary party into a parliamentary party which behaves benevolently towards the state to secure the survival as an organization and to stay as an integral part in the political arena. The groups are pushed into moderation, not a result of their ideological metamorphosis or civil obedience, but for strategic interests in order to achieve political power. The fourth element of the advanced version of the theoretical frame is the ideological moderation, the commitment to democratic pluralism, which is by nature subordinated to both strategic interest and organizational change. Ideological change is therefore taking place after the change in behavior. The fifth and last category adheres that the moderation of both ideological and behavioral nature is conducive to the transition to a democratic political system. Now I come to the redefinition of the theoretical framework. Tetzker agrees with the first assumptions, which were moderation by requesting the maximization of votes and because of the state repression. The third assumption that parties are incepted as organizations to survive and to expand. This interpretation appraises the value of ideology less than the degree of organization, also with regard to the motivation of the members and sympathizers. The ideology was in terms of relevance second-rated, but not reduced to meaningless rhetoric. To obtain the loyalty of the members, the ideological identity of the party must be obtained. Therefore, Tetzschner modifies the third assumption in the following way. The primacy of the organizational survival over pragmatic and ideological lines only works as long as party members are motivated by selective incentives like careers to keep faithful to the party. In the fourth assumption, Tetzschner corrects, due to his opinion, the wrong causal sequence of ideological change and behavioral change. He concludes that the concept of ideological change precedes to the change of behavioral pattern. Relating to the fifth category, Tetzschner accomplishes that the moderation of behavior does not always contribute to democratic transition and consolidation. With the increasing institutionalization of the former radical party, its willingness to change the undemocratic character of the regime declines. The inclusion-moderation hypothesis is well adapted to different ideological movements, and thus Schwedler reasoned in a far-reaching analogy, comparisons between the experiences of Islamist parties and those of Christian parties and socialist parties do demonstrate that moderation may have little to do with religion and everything to do with historical power struggles and local contents. For the analysis of the political participation of Hamas, I formed following hypotheses which are lean to the moderation model and modified due to the particular context of Palestine. Firstly, as soon as the leadership of Hamas has chosen to take part in elections, the Islamic worldview was modified, and in that way that Hamas not only stands for religious extremism, but adopts the problems of the people as they were: blocked social mobility, a lack of political freedom, economic despair, a sense of cultural vulnerability and humiliation. The second assumption has to be modified because Hamas does not operate in a prototypical authoritarian system of a sovereign national state. So it has, to that effect, modified that Hamas is domestically submitted to the repression attempts of a rival, and externally, if there is not shown good conduct on the certain fields compared with the security perceptions of Israel. Thirdly, Hamas always made its organizational survival prior to ideology opinions or programmatic changes for the purpose of achieving political goals. The permanence of Hamas is ensured on the basis of a functioning and broad organization. This basis and the followers are to be preserved by Hamas, also in change and in retaining power. The other concerns are subordinated to this goal. According to the fourth assumption, it is examined whether Hamas primarily changed the content or the method. Did Hamas make the decision for participation and then adapted the programmatic of the real existing situation, or have the theoretical principles been modernized in succession of basic considerations firstly? And in a final step, it is checked whether the inclusion of a single party has heralded the change of an entire political system. This question is all the more appropriate because Hamas is in the sequence of its sole reign of Gaza, the system itself. It is not free of authoritarian indications, and the democratic element of the elections is in danger to disappear from the agenda. The empirical analysis of Hamas is examined on the basis of two variables: the ideological and the programmatic sphere. The ideological worldview of Hamas is written in the Charter from 1988. There are two basic principles defining the core of the ideology of Hamas. Islam is the fundament of all nature, and the liberation of Palestine can only succeed with the use of violence. But the significance of the Charter has always been relativized both by Hamas and contemporary interprets with the growing temporal distance to the date of origin. For the first time, to the 15th anniversary of Hamas in 2002, two Hamas leaders have distanced themselves from the contents of the Charter. Khaled Mashal said, "The Charter should not be regarded as the fundamental ideological frame of reference from which the movement derives its position or on the basis of which it justifies its actions." Mashal repeated his statement again in 2008. At that point, Hamas is already governing Gaza for 2 years by declaring that pragmatics and the political realism had already replaced the Charter for a long time. I quote him, "So the whole world should deal with Hamas, with what it practices, its political stance that it declared, and not based on the Charter that was put 20 years ago." So undoubtedly, the Charter still exists in an unmodified version, and its contents have never been revised. The reasons, therefore, may be defiant. With reference to the ideology of Hamas written in the Charter, there has been no moderation over the decades, and that effect that only one word has been changed. The content is ignored and finds different interpretations, but still lays like a heavy burden in the absolutely real political programmatic of Hamas, to which I come now. Moderation concerning programmatic aspects requests precise written fixation of the modified point of views. This change of Hamas is exemplified by 3 essential strategy papers of Hamas, which were developed in 2005 and 2006. First, the electoral platform Change and Reform for the parliamentary elections in 2006, the draft program for a coalition government as a result of the election outcome in 2006, and thirdly, the cabinet platform for March 2006 after the failed building of a coalition. The contents of these documents leave no doubt that Hamas has made a political change in direct direction to a state-supportive party. The political moderation also contains the delicate section of the use of force by the definition of the right of resistance and the support of the two-state solution to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. While adhering ideologically to the abstract objective of liberating all of Palestine, Hamas has recently initiated a significant programmatic transformation towards the factual and pragmatic acceptance of a two-state solution. This change has gone widely unnoticed by Western observers, but fundamentally alters the parameters for engaging the movement in a constructive manner. After the decision was made to participate in the elections, Hamas started with the planning of the election campaign with the program Change and Reform. Hamas also presented a new political agenda. In the preamble of the paper, the participation of Hamas is described as a further instrument to support the resistance against the occupation, but at the same time, an advanced Palestinian civil society based on political pluralism and the rotation of power should be established. The outstanding part of the program is focused on civil aspects, and there are only 4 references to any form of military resistance. In the category internal politics, Hamas emphasizes the need for reforms concerning the political system and lays the perspective on the claim to establish a civil society. The program does not differ much from that of Fatah. The dogmatic and maximal positions of the Charter are not named in the electoral platform of 2005. The militant liberation of Palestine with all existing instruments is not demanded anymore. But the right to resist against the occupation is required. The moderation evident in Hamas's ideological documents was accompanied by moderation in behavioral policies along 3 dimensions: the participation in the elections, the de-radicalization by the use of force, and the willingness to negotiate with Israel. The cabinet platform, with the cabinet platform from 27th March 2006, presented by the new Prime Minister Ismail Haniyeh, the basis for the future work of the government was outlined, and the Palestinian population was assured that the Hamas government would take care of the welfare of all, and in doing so, seek to reconcile with Fatah. Haniyeh proceeded in his speech to contrast to the 2 previous Hamas documents, because on the one hand, the armed struggle was not mentioned once, and on the other hand, he admitted for the same time that within the context of the self-administration of Gaza, Hamas already stands in direct contact to Israeli authorities. The following conclusion can be made. These 3 documents represent in themselves an evolution in Hamas's political thinking toward pragmatism and the Palestinian mainstream, with the cabinet platform presented by Haniyeh reflecting very little inclination to radical positions. It is highly significant that the major reference to resistance in Haniyeh's speech highlights its importance to the past. Instead, the emphasis of the new phase of Hamas is on state building, so moderation also won in the moment of electoral victory. A comparison drawn to the Charter from 1988 finds out, compared to the Charter from 1988, this is different in tone. In Article 13 of the Charter, it is stated, there is no solution to the Palestine problem except through armed struggle. 2 decades later, Hamas is ready to use all means to find a solution. The pragmatic dimension of Hamas is nearly exclusively connected with the sole reign of Hamas in Gaza since 2007. Because on the one hand, Hamas did not have any government responsibility and consequently had less or none experience in the practice of comprehensive affairs of state. On the other hand, Hamas was confronted with huge practical challenges. Michael Bröning, a specialist on Palestine affairs, points out, ruling Gaza has transformed significant parts of Hamas from a violent state resistance movement into a de facto state actor charged with administrating a real existing political entity. Now I come to my conclusion. After adapting the theory to the modern times and making some modifications, the inclusion-moderation hypothesis, which evolved in the first quarter of the 20th century in Germany, can be applied and verified to an Islamist movement at an isolated coastal strip at the Mediterranean. The theory of moderation has passed the test of space from Germany to Gaza and in time from 1911 to 2012 well, and proves to be an accurate instrument checking the core question: does the political inclusion of Islamist actors lead to their moderation? Thereby, corresponding to the theory, it does not play a role if the participation in the political system was made only for tactical reasons, winning the political power, or in the acceptance of the democratic election model at the future state of Palestine. Because the cardinal question is the moderation of a group. The ideological transformations are accompanied by behavioral change, guided by strategic interests. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mr. Benedikt Grossmann. And Benedikt actually applied the moderation thesis to his case study of Palestinian Hamas. And if ideological or programmatic parties, seek political office in a democratic election system, so may change themselves from extreme or radical positions to the more central and mainstream positions in the political spectrum. So participation, especially in a democratic system of elections, change radical political parties, not only on the ground in terms of their behavior, but also in their discourses. So, and Palestinian Hamas exemplifies, you know, this change in recent times in the Middle East. And therefore, Benedikt challenges one of the stereotypical understandings of the Middle Eastern politics, that the Middle East is exceptional. Arab people or Islamists are exceptional people, so they are resisting to change. And I think he challenges this thesis, this understanding, this stereotypical thinking about the Arabs, Islamists in the region. So, and the people of the region may change themselves from the so-called radical to more mainstream and central positions if the context may change, if the political context, you know, changes. So now I am turning to our last panelist, Professor Finkelstein, and Finkelstein is going to provide his own assessment of the Arab-Israeli conflict.
Well, thank you for having me. I decided rather than give my own paper, I would comment on the three people who've spoken, because I've reached the age where I'm the senior citizen here, and I should play the role of the teacher for the younger people. There were three topics that were discussed this afternoon. I'll put them in slightly different order. The first question is, why does this conflict go on so long? Why does it persist? The second question is, what are the prospects for resolving this never-ending conflict in the wake, in the aftermath following the Arab awakening, the Arab Spring? And the third question is, if we're trying to find a solution to the conflict, will Hamas, the Islamic movement, will it be an obstacle to resolving the conflict, or is it possible that Hamas will play a constructive role in trying to find a solution? So, let me begin with the beginning, namely, the argument that the first person made was that it just doesn't seem to make sense that conflicts over Jerusalem, conflicts over borders, conflicts over the status of the Palestinian refugees, that these conflicts really are the reason that the conflict between Israel and Palestine hasn't been resolved. There's got to be a deeper reason. There has to be a more profound reason. And the reason that the first person suggested, she said that Israel is a very heterogeneous, a very mixed society, that religion, namely a state of the Jews, religion is not a strong enough force to hold Israeli society, especially because half of Israelis say they're not religious. And so Israel needs enemies in order to hold it together. As she put it, it's Israel's enemies that form the glue that holds Israeli society together. Now, there is no doubt that having enemies out there is useful to holding a society together. All America came together after 9/11. It was, from the point of view of the leaders of the country, it was a useful thing what happened because it united Americans. But does that mean that the Bush administration wanted 9/11 to happen? I think the answer is plainly no. If they had the choice, they wouldn't have wanted 9/11 to happen. But it's also true, once it happened, it had certain advantages for the Bush administration. And I think the same principle applies here. Yes, Israel, its leaders, gained some advantages from having enemies out there. There's no question about that. It unites the country. But if you ask the question, let us say, on the question of settlements, the Palestinians agreed Israel could keep all the settlements in place. On the question of refugees, the Palestinians agreed no refugees will go back to where they came from. And on the question of borders, the Palestinians agree that Israel can have whatever borders it wanted. If the Palestinians agreed to all of those demands, I think the Israelis would be very happy and they would sign a peace agreement with the Palestinians. So I don't think it's correct to say that there is no peace because Israel wants enemies. There is a distinction to be made between the advantages that Israel gets from having enemies, and that's true, they gain advantages, just like, as I said, Americans gained advantages from what happened in September 11th. But there's a very big difference, in my opinion, between saying that and saying that Israel would prefer to have enemies to signing a peace agreement in which it wins everything. If it can sign a peace agreement in which it wins everything, it will sign the agreement. So I think the question of borders, Jerusalem, settlements, and the refugees, those questions are real. And Israel is very stubborn about not giving any ground on those questions. The second issue is the effect of the Arab Spring. And the panelist who spoke was quite pessimistic that the Arab Spring will have a positive impact on the Israel-Palestine conflict. A number of things he said I happen to agree with. He said that the Arab Spring was mostly about the suffering of the Arab peoples in each of their countries. It was not about foreign policy issues primarily. He said that for most of the countries which had revolts. The Palestine issue, he said, was a minor sub-issue. I think that's probably correct. So, if all of that is true, then will the Arab Spring have an impact on the Palestine issue? And here I think I disagree with him on for a number of reasons. Number one, the Arab governments, the Muslim governments, they want to see the conflict end, not just for ideological reasons, but for practical reasons. Your government in Turkey, the Egyptian government, they want to modernize. They want to become part of the modern world. They don't want to always be behind China, behind Brazil, and of course, very far behind the United States and Europe. They are committed to bringing their countries into the modern world. And so for them, this Palestine issue is draining, is squandering, is wasting precious time and precious resources, which they would rather invest in their own countries. So they have a real material interest in finally putting an end to the conflict. Number two, if the Palestinians enter into revolt, a nonviolent civil revolt, if they do, and if, as is almost certain, Israel uses massive amounts of force to suppress the revolt, it's impossible that the government of Turkey and the government of Egypt can just sit by quietly. There will be a lot of popular anger at the way Israel is carrying on, using massive amounts of force, and the governments of Egypt and Turkey, for ideological reasons, for reasons of their own legitimacy, will have to show solidarity with the Palestinians. How far they'll go, it's hard to predict. A lot of it, again, depends on the Palestinians. If the Palestinians show real, sustained resistance, I think it's possible that Egypt and Turkey will show real, strong support. But I do agree with what he says. If the Palestinians do nothing, if the Arab Spring passes them by, it's true Egypt and Turkey will not do very much. A lot of it, I think, depends on what the Palestinians do. But I do not believe that the governments of Egypt and Turkey, whatever they would want to do, I don't think they can ignore what happens in Palestine if a real revolt and resistance develop. The third question is Hamas. And the panelist posed a question. He said that historically, if you look at so-called radical political parties, that when they are elected into power, for many reasons, they tend to become much more moderate. The classic example is the case of what was called the German Social Democratic Party, which was radical and Marxist, but by the turn of the century, meaning in the early 1900s, it became quite moderate as it started to win state elections. And so he asks the question, will the same thing happen to Hamas? And he answers the question in the affirmative, positively. He says, yes, you can already see Hamas is getting much more moderate. I would say I agree with what he's saying, but not exactly for the same reasons. The first and the most basic fact about the Palestinians is that they are a tiny people. It's a very small place with a small population. And they are dependent upon regional powers and international powers if they want to achieve their goals. And so typically what happens is whatever ideology Palestinians have, whatever ideology they have, once they get into positions of power and responsibility, they have to do what the international community says they must do. So up until the early 1970s, the Palestinian resistance led by the PLO under Mr. Arafat, they said, we will never accept Israel. It must be one state in Palestine. They called it a democratic, secular state. Then, in 1974, Mr. Arafat, he gets international legitimacy. He goes to the United Nations and he gives a famous speech. So now he's in the world of the great powers. He's at the UN. And they tell him, Mr. Arafat, if you want to have invitations to the United Nations, if you want to have the backing of the United Nations, then you have to use our language and you have to accept our terms for resolving the conflict. And already by the mid-1970s, the international community concluded that the only way to resolve the conflict is two states. And so once Mr. Arafat was in a position of power, once he's in a position of responsibility, he has to conform to, he has to accept the terms set out by the international community, because a tiny, tiny people cannot defy the whole world and hope to succeed. When Hamas started to change, it began to change in 2006 when it won that first parliamentary election in January of 2006. Now Hamas is in a position of responsibility. It is a governing party. And immediately as it becomes a governing party, the pressures of the international community come to bear on it. Hamas, if you want us to support you, if you want us to get Israel to negotiate with you, you have to accept the terms that we have set out for resolving the conflict. Otherwise, you will not get our support. And if you don't have our support, you do not have a prayer. And that's true. And so Hamas began to moderate its position because it's in a position now of responsibility, and it has to deal with, contend with the international community. In fact, the pressure on Hamas now is as great as before the Arab Spring. Why? If Hamas goes to its ideological ally, namely the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, it goes to its ally. Well, what does the head of state of Egypt say, Mr. Morsi? He says, we're not supporting one Islamic state in Palestine. Morsi gave a speech at the United Nations last week. He said, we support the Arab Peace Initiative. And the Arab Peace Initiative says 2 states, Israel and Palestine. So now, Hamas's ideological origin, which is the Muslim Brotherhood, they're telling him it's either 2 states or you lose us. He then goes to Turkey, because Turkey has been championing the cause of Hamas, at least since the Mavi Marmara. And what does Turkey say? Does anyone in this room think that the Turkish head of state is telling Hamas, you should fight for one state, one Islamic state in Palestine? Of course not. They're saying 2 states. And so even Hamas's main political ally and actual ideological origin, in this case being Egypt, political ally meaning Turkey, they're exerting the same force on Hamas. And so Hamas has to moderate itself, or it doesn't have any possibility of achieving success. The 2 other reasons Hamas has to moderate itself, as the panelist pointed out, once you get into power, you want to stay in power. That's a fact. Now, Hamas did not get elected because the people of Palestine liked their platform. I should say, Hamas did not get elected because the people of Palestine supported their ideology. That's not correct. They got elected because Fatah was so corrupt, and Hamas had a good record for honesty and clean government. So now you get elected not because of your ideology, but because you're honest and you run a basically clean government. And the people will not re-elect you if you start being too ideological, because they didn't elect you for your ideology in the first place. For better or for worse, you can decide for yourself. Palestine is, I wouldn't say it's a secular society, but it's certainly more secular than many other parts in the Middle East. And so there's no possibility that an ideologically extreme religious party can stay in power if it's too extreme in its religious convictions. Those 3 reasons, it seems to me, number 1, the regional facts of power. Number 2, the fact that Hamas wasn't elected because of its ideology in the first place. And number 3, Palestine is not a particularly extreme religious place. For those 3 reasons, I think it was inevitable that Hamas would moderate itself. And I think he's completely correct. Hamas is not an obstacle to resolving the conflict. Hamas has repeatedly said, we'll accept the state in the June 67 border. Hamas is not the obstacle to the conflict. The obstacle to the conflict is, I think, pretty straightforward, and that's where I'll leave you. Jenny thinks there's a deeper reason. She thinks it's because Israel needs enemies. I think the reason is very straightforward why the conflict hasn't ended. Because this is the first cost-free occupation in human history. It doesn't cost Israel anything, this occupation. All the work of policing the Palestinians, keeping them repressed, all of that work is done by the Palestine Authority, by other Palestinians. They run the torture chambers, they run the jails. Israel doesn't have any burden of policing the occupation. Number two, all the financial burdens of the occupation, they're all paid for by the Europeans. The Europeans have all of these NGOs. They give all the monies to make the occupation cost-free for Israel. In fact, the Europeans are so obedient that every once in a while Israel goes in, destroys everything the Europeans built, and then a few weeks later the Europeans come back and they rebuild what Israel destroyed. So there is no military policing costs. There are no economic costs. And all the political costs are paid for by the United Nations. Are paid for by the United States, which is the United Nations, but that's a separate one. Are paid for by the United States. So the United Nations, the U.S. exercises its veto. It twists the arms of all the countries, makes them afraid. So Israel has no political costs. So if you have no costs of policing, no economic costs, no political costs, why should you give in? There's no reason, no rational reason why Israel should negotiate. There is no incentive to negotiate. If you want to end the occupation, you have to make the cost of keeping the occupation higher than the cost of withdrawing. I always get that wrong. Did I get it right? No, it's the reverse. Oh, no, yeah. If you want to end the occupation, Israel has to become convinced that it's cheaper to withdraw than to stay. And right now, it costs nothing. So of course they're going to stay. Thank you.
Professor Finkelstein, many thanks for your valuable contribution. I think we have not much time left for this panel, but we can get a couple of questions, you know, not more. 3 questions. I think we can get just one, you know. Alabiliriz. Soracak. Oradan o zaman. Please keep your questions as short as possible so that no, it's okay. Please go ahead.
فانكلشتاين. الصبح كنت تحدث عن نموذج غاندي لحل المشكلة الفلسطينية. أنا أعتقد بأن الوضع يختلف، لأن غاندي كان يعمل استعمار بريطاني في مجال التجاري. لذلك ضبط التجارة جعل الاستعمار البريطاني يكلف فتدفعهم المبادرة. في فلسطين يقول أن إسرائيل لها هدف آخر وهو الأرض وليس التجارة. لذلك استراتيجية غاندي لا أعتقد بأنها تسأل هذه المنطقة. لعل نموذج الخطاب في نموذج يدل على أنه ممكن في العمل المسلح نتائج. لذلك استطاع أن يحرك جنوب لبنان ليس بمقاومة الآن وإنما بمقاومة مسلحة. كذلك الأستاذ فينكلشتاين يراهن كثير على المجتمع الدولي وضرب نموذج عرفات، يعني حتى تكون حماس تشابه عرفات من حيث الاعتدال. عرفات حصل على جائزة نوبل وبين بأنه معتدل. على ماذا حصل عرفات يعني بعد كل هذه الاعتدال؟ فهل المطلوب أن حماس تسير على خطى عرفات وتنتهي بنهاية عرفات يعني معزول، ثم بعد ذلك هناك احتمال أنه مات مقتول ولم يحصل من ورود نصره على شيء؟ أكتفي بهذين السؤالين.
So who is going to answer all?
Very short. I'll try to repeat the question. Is this working? The question was really in three parts. The first part of the question was, how can you compare India with Palestine? Because in India, the goal of the British was economic. They wanted to derive some economic benefit from India. And he said in the case of Palestine, the goal of the Israelis is very different. They want to drive the population out. And I think that's factually correct. The second question he asked is about the use of armed force. And he makes the point that in the case of Lebanon, the Hezbollah was able successfully, through the use of armed force, to drive the Israelis out of South Lebanon. And isn't that a relevant precedent for the Palestinians? And the third question he asked was, well, I think the third question was about what value was moderation for the Palestinians. Arafat went to the United Nations, and in the end, he says Arafat was murdered. What value is it to appeal to the international community? Is that a fair summary of your three questions? Yeah. Okay. So I think maybe we could just divide among ourselves. Is there any questions any of you would like to answer of those three?
Well, Hamas in regard, and actually the questions were directed at Professor Finkelstein, but regarding the transformation of Hamas ideology, Hamas indeed is following the path of Fatah in regard to this transformation. And if I want to give you a date, Hamas finds itself now around 1974 in terms of the transformation of its ideology. So it is on the path of Fatah, if you want it or not, because Hamas is within, as a tiny state, a small nation, you need to adjust to regional rules, to the international rules, or leave the government. And Hamas is not willing to leave the government, to give it up, so they are adjusting. And the only difference is that the United Nations in 1974 received Arafat, who acknowledged indirectly, actually, Israel at that time, indirectly, and the right of Israel, the two-state solution, whereas the international community asked Hamas from the beginning to acknowledge Israel directly. And as at that time, beginning of the 70s, Fatah was not ready to do this, Hamas was not ready as well to do it by 2006. But we can compare it to that Hamas is following the path of Fatah in this transformation of ideologies. Yeah.
I want to just briefly answer one of the questions because it has to do with Turkey. I think that people tend to underestimate the power of nonviolent civil disobedience to defeat Israel, and people tend to overestimate Israel's power internationally. So, let's take a couple of recent examples. When the Mavi Marmara went to Gaza, 9 passengers were killed. 8 of them were Turkish citizens, 1 was an American Turkish citizen. When the 9 people were killed, it caused a very big problem for Israel because Turkey, whether it wanted to or not, it could not stand by idly and do nothing. It was an attack on Turkish citizens. And it created a major crisis for Israel. And to this day, Israel has not been able to resolve, or has been unwilling to resolve that crisis with Turkey. The second time Israel faced a pretty major crisis was when the Palestinian prisoners went on the hunger strike. Now, a hunger strike is a typical Gandhian act, to go on a fast. For reasons I will never understand, the Palestinian hunger strikers showed superhuman discipline. I could fast for 1 day, I can fast for 2 days, but there we were talking about 70 days. Amazing feats, amazing achievements of self-discipline. And Israel, in the end, it had to give in. Why did it give in? Because here is this Arab Spring, and all of these dictatorial governments are shooting down nonviolent resistors. And the Israelis were very afraid, if any of these hunger strikers die, there's going to be an explosion in the West Bank, and they're going to have to start shooting Palestinians like they did in Libya, like they did in Syria. And so in the mind of the world, hey, Israel's no different than Gaddafi. Israel is no different than Bashar. And so the Americans told the Israelis, don't create a mess like that. You better agree to the terms of the hunger strikers. And the lesson is, Israel is much more vulnerable to international public opinion than people understand. It is true in the case of the Mavi Marmara, were it not for the backing of the Turkish government, they would probably have gotten away with killing the 9 passengers and it would have been forgotten in a week. But in the case of the Mavi Marmara, a quite powerful government, namely Turkey, intervened. In the case of the hunger strikers, it was dependent on the fact that Israel did not want to look like Syria and Libya. So there are always some circumstances, but I think the fact is that nonviolent civil resistance can be successful there. I happen not to believe it could have been successful in South Lebanon, because most of the world doesn't care what goes on in South Lebanon. Israel used to routinely bomb it. Nobody really cared. But for historical reasons, the world does care about what goes on in Palestine. And so Israel is not as free to carry on in Palestine as it does in Lebanon. In Lebanon, I do believe it required an armed resistance to drive the Israelis out. In Palestine, 1, I do not believe an armed resistance will succeed, and 2, I do not believe it's necessary. I think a nonviolent civil resistance on a mass scale can drive the Israelis out.
Unfortunately, the normal time for our panel is over. You know, it's already over, unfortunately, I'm not taking any more questions. So thanks for our panelists here, and on behalf of Sakarya University and the Institute of Social Sciences, I'm going to present some certificate for each panelist, appreciating their participation and presentation, their contributions. So, Phillip, Amour, yeah.
I mean, we can still interact in the break.
Yeah. So
in case you have questions, I'm sure we can still interact.
Is for you and Professor.
Oh yeah.
So thanks for all coming here, participating, and for your attention. You know.
I mean, the same thing.